The city has been holding itself in for 10 years, and it has begun to show. Cities do that. They take on a posture. Walk up to this one from the plain in the early morning, before the light has properly arrived, and you can feel it the way you feel a person in a room who has not slept. The gates shut earlier than gates ought to be shut. The sentries doubled and doubled again. The streets worn into the shapes that fear makes. A well that everyone hurries away from because it is too near the wall. A market that has moved twice. A lane that people no longer use for no reason anyone can name. The walls themselves are extraordinary. They slope outward at the base so that they lean away from you as you approach, faced with dressed limestone, thicker than a room is wide. There is a tower at the eastern gate that stands over everything. The gates are set in a dogleg so that anyone coming through has to turn and turn again and be looked at from above the whole time. Whoever built this expected to be attacked, and was right. Inside, above the streets, the citadel, the palace, the shrines, the storerooms, the flat roofs, where people sleep in summer because it is cooler. And on the walls, worn smooth in certain places, the particular patches of stone where the women of this city have stood every day for a decade, watching a plane they cannot go down onto. There is a fig tree by the wall. There is a beaten track along the top of the rampart. There is a smell in the lower town of too many people and not enough water. Smoke and dust ground fine by feet, and animals kept indoors that ought to be out grazing, and the sour warmth of a place where everyone has been indoors together for far too long. The city has held. That is the thing to understand before we go on. 10 years, and the walls have never been taken, not once, not for an hour. And this morning the plain is empty. Come out onto the wall with the first person who sees it, because someone always sees it first. And in this case, it is a sentry at the end of a long night, cold and not really looking. The mist is lying in the low ground by the river the way it does before sunrise, and out beyond that, where the Greek camp has stood for 10 years. The ships pulled up in their long rows, the huts, the ditch, the palisade, the smoke of 1,000 cooking fires going up every dawn since before some of the children in the city were born. There is nothing. No masts. No smoke. The palisade is down. The huts are burned to black rectangles on the sand, still steaming faintly where the dew has settled on the ash. The sea beyond is entirely bare from one headland to the other. He looks at it for a long moment without understanding it, the way you look at a familiar room with the furniture gone. Then he starts shouting, "Let yourself sink a little wherever you are lying." This is a story about waiting, and about how long a person can hold still, and there is nothing in it that will jolt you. The loud part is a long way off, and we are going to go slowly. And if you fall asleep in the middle of the dark part, that is exactly right. If these long nights are any use to you, Alec helps this quiet channel find other people awake at this hour. And I like knowing who is out there. Put your town and the time on your clock in the comments, and I will read them in the morning. Now come down off the wall, because the whole city is going down onto the plain, and they are going to walk out through gates that have not been opened in daylight for years. You have to picture what that is like. There are people in that crowd who have never been outside the walls, children of 7 and 8, born under siege, who have grown up in a stone town where the horizon is a rampart. They are walking through wet grass for the first time in their lives. The ground is churned everywhere, dried into hard ridges. There are things half buried in it that nobody looks at directly. There is the ditch, and the line of stakes, and the black squares of the burned huts, and the long shallow grooves in the sand where the ships were dragged down into the water, fresh grooves made in the night, filling slowly with seawater at the bottom. People are laughing, some are weeping. A great many of them are simply standing on the beach in the early sun with their hands hanging, looking at an empty sea. And behind them, up where the camp met the dunes, there is a thing standing on the sand that they have all been carefully not walking toward. It is enormous. It is a horse, made of timber, and it is taller than the tallest house in the city, and it is standing 4 square on the sand on a wide flat cradle of beams, and the light of the low sun is coming across it and throwing a shadow 40 feet long. The wood is new. That is the first thing you would notice up close, and it is the smell that reaches you before anything else. Fresh sawn fir, sap still wet in the joints. That sharp, bright, resinous smell that a woodyard has, entirely out of place on a beach where nothing has smelled of anything but tar and smoke for 10 years. The workmanship is very fine. Pegged, not nailed. The grain matched. The main carved in rows. And there is writing on it, on the near side, cut cleanly into the flank, so that anyone can read it. An offering to the goddess for a safe journey home. Nobody in that crowd knows that 30 men are sitting inside it, in the dark, and have been since the middle of the night. Go back 3 days to a meeting in a hut with a leaking roof. The war has stopped working. That is the honest position, and everyone in that hut knows it. The best fighter on the Greek side is dead, shot in the ankle months ago by a man with a bow. The second best is dead too, by his own hand, after losing a vote. The prophecies have all been satisfied one by one, at enormous cost. The bow of Heracles fetched from an island, the young son of the dead champion fetched from another, the sacred image stolen out of the temple in the middle of the night by 2 men in rags. Every condition has been met, and the walls are still standing, and they have been standing all along, and no army in the world takes walls like those by climbing them. So the man from the small rocky island stands up and says he has an idea. And the idea is a carpentry problem. Some tellings give the idea to the goddess herself, whispering it. Others say a seer suggested it. The oldest surviving mention of the horse, and it is only a few lines sung by a poet at a feast in a completely different story years later, simply calls it the horse that he filled with men, and moves on. He does not build it. That matters, and it is one of the details I like most in the whole tradition. The builder is a man named Epeios, and Epeios is not a hero. He is a boxer, good enough to win the funeral games, and he says so at the time with a boastfulness that reads as nerves. He is famous in the camp for 2 things. The first is that he is the best carpenter in the army. The second, which the tradition preserves with no cruelty at all, is that he is a coward. He says it himself in one version. His father was cursed, and the curse landed on him as fear, and he cannot help it. And this man, who weeps when he is frightened, builds the thing that ends the war, and then climbs inside it and sits in the dark with the bolt in his hand, because he is the only one who knows how the door works. That is a better story than a brave man doing it, and the Greeks kept it. Watch him work. 3 days with every carpenter in the army under him, and a goddess helping. The timber comes down off the mountain behind the city. Fir cut green, dragged by mule teams down the same slopes that supplied the ships that started all this. Adzes, augers, a bow drill going all day with that dry squeaking rhythm. Pegs cut from harder wood and soaked so they swell in the holes. The joints fitted so closely that the seams are almost invisible from a distance, which is the whole point. The frame goes up first, and it is a ship's frame, essentially. A keel piece and ribs and a skin over it. That is not decorative. Everyone in that camp knows how to build a hull, and a hull is a hollow shape that keeps water out and holds men inside. And this is exactly that, upside down on land. There is a trap door in the belly with a bolt that only opens from within. There is a rope ladder coiled inside. There are breathing holes, small ones, worked into the carving so the eye passes over them. In the mane, in the flare of the nostrils, in the joins of the flank, and the numbers. How many men were in it is one of the great pleasant arguments of antiquity because nobody could agree, and the answers vary wildly. A late epic poem names them and reaches about 30. Another source says 23. A tragedy says 50. A Roman commentator, writing helpfully for students, reports that some authorities said 3,000, which is not a real number but is a wonderful indication of what the story had turned into by then. The sensible reading, if you want one, enough men to open a gate and no more. 30 is plenty. 30 picked men with the gate opened from inside is how cities actually fell in that period. Who went in is worth the moment, because the list is not what you would pick. The obvious ones are there. the man whose idea it was, the husband of the woman who left, the son of the great fighter from the north, who has already done one-night operation behind the walls and is the only man on that beach who has ever wounded a god. And then there is a boy. He is perhaps 17. He arrived at the camp within the last few months, fetched from an island in the eastern Aegean, where his mother's family had hidden him because a prophecy said the city could not fall without him. He is the son of the best fighter who ever lived, and he never met his father, who died before he came. We know how he behaved inside the horse, and we know it from an unusual place. It is told by the man who did the holding, later in the land of the dead, to the boy's father. That is one of the gentlest scenes in all of Greek literature, and almost nobody knows it is there. A dead man asks after his son, "Did the boy turn out well? Was he brave?" And the answer is, he sat in that horse in the dark, and all the other men, the leaders, the veterans, the famous ones, were wiping their eyes, and their legs were shaking under them, and every one of them was watching him. And he never once went pale, and he never once wept. He kept asking to be let out. He kept his hand on the hilt and asked over and over when they were going to open the door. And the poem says the dead man walked away across the field of pale flowers, taking long strides, delighted, because he had been told his son was excellent. Two things about that. The first is that it is an unusually honest piece of reporting about fear. The commander of the operation, given the chance to describe his own men, says plainly that the great heroes of Greece sat in the dark shaking and crying, and that the only one who did not was too young to have learned to. The second is what happens to that boy afterwards, which is the reason the story has an edge to it. He comes down that ladder, and what he does in the next few hours at an altar in a courtyard is the single act that most disgusts later Greeks about their own side. And it is remembered in poetry and painted on pots for 1,000 years. The calmest person in the box turns out to be the worst thing to come out of it. Nobody in the older poem says that out loud. The dead father is told his son was brave and goes away happy, and the poet leaves it there. And every listener in the audience already knew the rest and had to sit with it. There were others. A late epic names about 30 of them, and most are nobody. A man from Thessaly, a couple of brothers, an archer, a healer's son, ordinary, competent soldiers who were picked because they could sit still, and the carpenter, of course, with his hand on the bolt. Now, the rest of the army has to disappear. They break the camp in one night. Everything burns. The huts, the palisade, the ditch filled in where it can be. 10 years of a town on a beach reduced to charcoal in the dark. The ships go down the grooves into the water and out past the headland, and then round the back of an island a couple of hours' sail offshore, and they anchor there, out of sight of the walls, and wait. There is one more piece, and it is the piece that actually does the work. They leave a man behind. He is a cousin of the man who thought of the horse in most versions, and he is left tied up, or apparently tied up, in the reeds by the river, with a story ready and the ability to cry on demand. His job is to be found and to be brought in front of the king and to lie for about an hour without once being caught out. And in the meantime, 30 men climb a ladder in the dark. Go in with them, because we are going to be in here a long time and you should know the shape of it. The ladder is a rope one, and it swings. You go up it in armor, with a hand up and a hand down, and the trapdoor above you is a rectangle of slightly less dark, and somebody reaches out and takes your wrist and pulls you through. Inside, the space is the shape of a boat turned over. Curved ribs above you, close enough to touch. A floor of planks laid across the beams, which is not level because the belly of a horse is not level, and there is a slight fall toward the front that everyone will be leaning against all night. It smells of the woodyard, sap and sawdust in the corners where the sweeping mist, and the sharp green scent of fur that has been cut this week and has not dried out. Under that, within an hour, it smells of men, leather, wet wool, oil on bronze, and 30 people breathing in a space with 4 small holes in it. They sit in 2 rows facing each other, along the sides, with their backs against the ribs and their legs drawn up. The armor goes on the floor between them, laid flat, not stacked. And this is the detail that will matter more than any other tonight. Bronze on bronze makes a noise, and a shield set down carelessly against a wooden wall will ring like a struck bell. Because that is what they are sitting inside. A hollow wooden box with a skin stretched over curved ribs is not a hiding place. It is an instrument. It is the same shape and the same construction as the body of a lyre, a resonator, built to take a small vibration and make it bigger. Every sound that touches this thing from outside will come through the wood and be amplified in the space they are sitting in. And every sound they make inside will go out the same way. They are hiding inside an ear and a mouth. Nobody has to explain that to them. They work it out in the first 10 minutes. When someone shifts his foot and the whole belly of the horse gives a low resonant knock, and 30 men go completely still at once. And then the waiting begins. And this is the part of the story that nobody ever tells properly, so let us do it slowly. It is the middle of the night when the last man comes up. The camp burns down around them. They can hear it, a long crackling roar that goes on for hours, and the light of it comes in through the breathing holes and moves on the wood above their heads. They can hear the ships going down the sand, the rollers, the shouting, the slap of hulls hitting water. And then that fades, and then it stops. And then there is nothing at all. The fires burn down. The light goes out of the holes. The sound of the sea, which has been under everything for 10 years, is suddenly the only thing left. And it is very loud. And by an hour later, nobody hears it anymore. Count it out. 2 hours in the dark before there is any gray in the holes. Another hour before the birds. Another before you could see the man opposite you. And when you can, what you see is a face doing nothing at all, which is what everyone's face is doing. There is no talking. There is no whispering, because whispering is a hiss, and a hiss carries. There is one bucket. I mention it because everybody wonders, and nobody says it. And the practical reality of 30 armed men in a wooden box for the better part of a day and a night is not glamorous, and was probably discussed in advance at some length by a carpenter with a leaking roof. You cannot stretch, you cannot stand. Your legs go first, the numbness, then the pins and needles, then the deep ache in the hip from the boards. Your back goes second, and then, somewhere in the 4th or 5th hour, your mind goes somewhere else entirely because it has to. That is what long stillness does. Anyone who has lain awake for hours without moving so as not to wake somebody else knows the state. Half dream, drifting, entirely present, and entirely elsewhere at once. Some of them sleep. That is certain, whatever the poems say. 30 men in the dark, half of them awake all the previous night. Some of them are asleep by dawn and are woken by the shouting. And the shouting, when it comes from a long way off and gets closer. They can hear the crowd before they can hear any words. A rising, uneven roar coming across the sand, thousands of voices, and under it, the flat drumming of feet on packed ground. And then, the crowd is around them, and the crowd is going all the way round, and the wood is picking up all of it, hands slapping the flank, someone knocking on it with a knuckle, a child's voice directly beneath the trapdoor. 30 men sit absolutely still and listen to a city walk around them. Now, outside, the argument. It runs for most of the morning, and it is entirely reasonable, and both sides make good points, and that is what makes it terrible. One faction wants it burned. Take axes to it, or push it off the cliff into the sea, or pile brush and set it alight where it stands. One faction wants it hauled up to the citadel as a trophy and dedicated to the goddess whose name is carved on the flank. And one of the priests comes down through the crowd and tells them plainly that they are being fools, and says the line that everyone has been quoting ever since, that he fears the Greeks, and particularly when they are bringing gifts. Then he takes a spear and throws it. It goes into the flank and sticks, quivering, and the whole thing shakes. And inside, in the dark, the shock of the impact goes through the wood and into every piece of bronze on the floor. And the armor rings. Not loudly. A dull, hollow, unmistakable sound. Metal and a cavity, and 30 men who have just been told by physics that they are going to die in a box. The poet who tells this best says that if the will of heaven had not been against it, and if men's minds had not been elsewhere, he would have driven them to break the thing open, and the city would be standing yet. But the crowd is already turning away, because at that exact moment, there is a commotion at the back. Shepherds dragging a young man out of the reeds with his hands tied, and everyone wants to see. Inside, they cannot see any of it. Everything from here on for them arrives as sound. That is the discipline of the story, and it is worth keeping to. 30 men in a wooden box are receiving the fall of a city as an audio broadcast, with no picture, and having to work out from tone and volume alone whether they are about to be burned alive. So, they hear the crowd move away toward the reeds. They hear it become a different kind of noise. The tight, interested murmur of people watching an interrogation rather than the loose roar of a festival. They cannot hear the words. They can hear the shape. A young voice, going on for a long time, breaking twice. Older voices interrupting. A pause. The young voice again, quieter. And then everyone very quiet indeed. And then a sound that goes through the whole crowd at once, which is the sound people make when they have decided to believe something. What he told them, we know, because a Roman poet gave him 100 lines of it, and it is one of the great performances in literature. He told them he was a deserter, that his own side had turned on him, that a prophecy had demanded a human sacrifice for a fair wind home, and that he had been chosen for it and had run in the night. He showed them the ropes. He told them the horse was an offering to the goddess, built as a penance for the stolen image, and that it had been made deliberately enormous so that it could not be brought inside the walls, because the priests had warned that if the Trojans ever got it in, the goddess would transfer her protection, and this city would sack Greece instead. Every part of that is a hook, and every part of it is designed to make them do the one thing they should not. You can see how good it is. He does not ask them to take it in. He tells them they cannot, and gives them a reason to want to. Roman readers inherited that version as the definitive one, and it is where nearly all our detail comes from. The Greek sources are much thinner. A summary of a lost epic mentions him in a line, and the older poem gives him nothing at all. The lyre in the reeds may be a late refinement of a much simpler story in which the Trojans simply made a mistake, and then, while the crowd is still deciding, the thing happens with the priest. They hear that too, and only that. A change in the noise from the direction of the shore. A single voice raised, and then raised differently. Then screaming. Not the crowd screaming, one man, and then the crowd, and then feet running in every direction at once, hundreds of them, and someone falling against the leg of the horse and scrambling up. Whatever happened out there took perhaps a minute. 2 great serpents came in from the sea, the story says, in coils, with their heads up out of the water, and went straight up the beach to the priest who had thrown the spear, and took him and his 2 sons, and afterwards went up to the citadel and coiled at the feet of the goddess's statue. There is a famous sculpture of that, dug up in a vineyard in Rome 1,500 years later, and the moment it came out of the ground, it changed the direction of European art. Michelangelo went to look at it the day it was found. Inside the horse, none of that is visible. There is only the noise, and then the shouting afterwards, and the tone of the shouting has changed completely, because the crowd has just watched the one man who argued against the horse be destroyed in front of them immediately, in the open, by something that came out of the sea. They read it as a verdict. Of course they do. Anyone would. And that is the moment the argument ends. One more voice tries. A woman's from up near the gate, and she is saying the same thing she has been saying for years and in the same way, which is too loudly and too specifically and with too much certainty, and everybody has long since stopped hearing it. She is the king's daughter, and she can see what is coming, and she has been cursed to never be believed. Some say she attacked the horse herself with a torch and an axe and had to be pulled off it. Inside, they hear a woman screaming, and then people laughing at her, and then the sound of her being led away. The tragedians were interested in her more than in anyone else in this story for an obvious reason. A person who knows exactly what will happen and cannot make it not happen is a better subject then a soldier in a box. Then the ropes come. They hear the preparations for hours, timber being dragged up, hammering, the particular shriek of green wood under strain, men counting. Rollers are cut and laid, and the cradle is levered up onto them, and cables of twisted hide are made fast around the chest and around the legs, and hundreds of people take hold, and the whole thing begins to move, and everything inside moves with it. That is the part nobody thinks about. The floor tilts. Everything not held down slides. 30 men brace their feet against the ribs and hold their shields flat against their bodies so they cannot ring. And the horse goes up the beach at walking pace, swaying on rollers, with a city singing around it. They are singing hymns. The girls of the town are walking alongside with garlands, and the whole population is at it, and the sound comes in through the breathing holes very clearly. The wall will not admit it. It is too tall. So they break their own defenses to get it in. They take down a section of the rampart above the gate, or widen the gate itself. And the stones come out and are stacked aside, and that is how the horse comes through, over the rubble of the wall the Greeks could never breach. And here the Roman poet gives us the detail that makes the hair on your arm stand up, and it is the one that pays off everything we said about the horse being an instrument. 4 times, he says, it stuck at the very threshold of the gate, and 4 times the armor clashed inside its belly. 4 times, and they went on pulling. He adds one line after it, and it is the coldest in the poem, and we pressed on regardless, blind, and set the thing on the sacred citadel. Inside, in the dark, in the swaying, 30 men hear their own weapons betray them 4 separate times, and hear the singing continue over the top of it. They are on the citadel now, and the light is going, and the city begins to celebrate. This is the longest stretch, and the strangest. And if you are going to drift off tonight, I suspect it will be somewhere in here, which is fine because the men inside are drifting too. Understand what is happening outside. 10 years. 10 years of rationing and funerals and standing on a wall. And it is over this afternoon without a fight. The army is gone. The sea is empty. The gods have spoken twice in one morning, unmistakably in front of everybody. So they do what any human beings would do. They open everything. The wine comes out of the storerooms, the good wine, the jars that have been sitting sealed at the back for years because nobody would broach them during a siege. They kill animals they have been keeping alive for milk. The temples are open, and the incense is going, and the smoke of it drifts up over the citadel in the still evening air and comes in through the breathing holes with everything else. There is music from 3 directions at once, and none of it in the same key. There is dancing in the square directly below. There are people singing in the streets, badly, in the way people sing when they are not performing. And there are the small sounds, which are worse. A woman calling a child in for the night. 2 men arguing amiably about something, and then laughing. Somebody dragging a bench across a courtyard. A dog. A baby, somewhere close, that will not settle. And a voice going over and over the same short tune to get it down. 30 men sit in the dark 6 feet above all of it and listen to a town having the best evening of its life. That is the thing this story is actually about, and I do not think it is about cleverness at all. Every man in that horse could stop this. Any one of them could put a fist against the wood or shout or simply cough. The whole thing hangs on 30 individual people, hour after hour, each one privately deciding over and over to do nothing. And doing nothing is much harder than fighting. Anyone who has ever had to sit still and quiet through something they wanted enormously to interrupt knows the sensation in the chest. Some of them are frightened. Some are wound so tight they are shaking. And some, this is in the sources, and it is the most interesting part, are simply undone by the ordinariness of what they are hearing. 10 years of thinking about a city as a wall with enemies behind it, and now, through 4 small holes, a lullaby. The hours go on. The noise thins. By what must be the middle of the night, the singing has stopped, and the music has stopped, and there are only footsteps now, occasional, unsteady, going home. Doors, a shudder. The heat of the day was worse than any of this, and I skipped it. So, let me give it to you before the night closes in. By late morning, the sun is full on the flank, and the wood begins to work. New timber does that. It takes the heat and gives off its sap, and the whole inside of the horse fills with the smell of hot resin, sweet and thick, until it is difficult to think about anything else. The pegs creak as the joints move. Somewhere above them, a plank ticks as it expands, at intervals, like something being tapped. 30 men in armor, in a closed wooden space, in a Mediterranean afternoon. There is no water ration that makes that pleasant. The floorboards go slick. 2 of the older men are gray by midday and are made to lie flat. And through it, from below, the noise of the celebration building. There is one more thing to say about the woman who is coming, and it belongs here because it explains how she was able to do what she does. She had met one of them already. Not long before any of this, weeks perhaps, a beggar came into the city. He came in through the gate in daylight, filthy, wearing a rag that would not have covered a slave, with wheals and bruises all over him. He had done that to himself. That is the detail everyone remembers. He took a whip to his own back and shoulders before he went, because a beggar who has not been beaten is not a beggar anybody believes in. He went through the streets of the enemy city, holding out his hand. He was counting. That is what he was there for. Gates, guard rotations, which quarters were held by which allies, how the citadel was reached, where the walls were weakest. And one person in that city looked at him twice. She took him into a house and washed him herself and gave him clothes and oil and swore an oath not to say a word until he was safely back through the lines. She says, in her own telling of it, that they talked a long time, and that by then her heart had already turned, that she was sick with what she had done, that she wept for a home she had left behind. And she let him go with everything he had come for, which means that when she stands under the horse in the dark and starts calling the names of the men inside it, she is not guessing. She has had a long private conversation with the man who planned this, at a moment when he owed her his life. Now hold both of those next to each other, because this is where the story becomes genuinely difficult and rather wonderful. If she helped him then, why is she doing this now? The husband, telling it years later, has an explanation ready, and it is a convenient one. A god put her up to it, a power that wanted glory for the other side, and there was a Trojan prince standing at her shoulder the whole time. So perhaps she had no choice about being there at all. Other readers have proposed the opposite, that she was testing them, that she suspected the horse and wanted to know, and used the only instrument she had, or that she was warning them in the only way that would not get her killed by the man beside her, or that a woman who has spent 10 years being blamed by 2 nations simply wanted for one night to make 30 men feel what she had been feeling. The poem says none of it. The poem gives you the fact and the 2 accounts and moves the conversation onto something else. What is certain is that she did it, and that a man nearly died of it, and that both husband and wife were sitting by the same fire years afterwards, telling a young stranger their separate versions, while the wool turned on the distaff. And then there is a woman standing directly below them, in the dark, on the stones of the citadel, and she has come alone, or nearly alone, and she has come deliberately, and she starts to walk around the horse. She goes round it 3 times. She puts her hand flat on the wood as she goes. You can hear the drag of a palm on timber. And then she begins to call the names of the men inside, not in her own voice. She calls them one after another, and for each man, she uses the voice of that man's wife. Sit with that a moment, because it is the strangest single detail in the whole Trojan story, and it is not a late embellishment. It comes from the oldest source we have, and it is told at a dinner table by someone who was there. She works down the line. A name, and then a voice that has not been heard for 10 years, saying that name from 6 feet away in the dark. Inside, men who have held perfectly still through a spear in the flank and 4 crashes at the gate begin to come apart. 2 of them start to get up. The son of the great fighter from the north, A man who has stolen a statue out of a temple and gone on a night raid behind enemy lines actually rises to his feet in the dark. The husband of the woman doing the calling, who has crossed the sea and spent a decade on a beach precisely to hear that voice again, rises with him. They are held down, and then a third man opens his mouth to answer. His name is Antiklos, and he is not famous for anything else, and he is about to answer his wife. And the man from the rocky island, who is sitting nearest, and who has been watching this coming, and who is the reason all of them are in this box, puts both hands over Antiklos's mouth and holds them there. That is what Odysseus heard inside the wooden horse. That is the answer to the question we started with. He heard, one after another, the voices of the wives of every man sitting near him, calling into the dark, and what he did about it was clamp his hands over another man's face and hold on in silence, in the dark, for as long as it took. The poem says he held him until the goddess led her away. How long that is, it does not say. Long enough that the poet thought it worth mentioning, long enough for a man to stop struggling. Some later sources are harsher and say Antiklos did not survive it, that he was smothered, and that the others buried him quietly afterwards. The oldest version does not say that, and I prefer to leave him alive, because the story does not need it, and because the poem is careful with him. Now, the framing of this scene is the part that stops me every time, and I want to give it to you properly, because it is one of the great pieces of construction in ancient literature. We are not hearing this on the citadel. We are hearing it years later, at a dinner in a palace in the south of Greece, on a quiet evening in peacetime. The king who has told it is the one whose wife's voice was used. He is telling it to a visiting young man, the son of the man who did the holding, who has come looking for news of a father who never came home, and she is in the room. She has come down from her chamber and taken a chair by the fire, and she has her wool basket beside her on wheels and a golden distaff in her hand. She is spinning while he talks. And a few minutes earlier, at the same fire, she told the same visitor her own story about the same siege. And it is a completely different kind of story. In hers, a beggar came into the city one night, filthy, beaten, disguised, and she alone recognized him. And she took him in and washed him and gave him clothes and swore an oath not to give him away and let him go back out with everything he had come to find out. In her telling, she was helping. In her telling, her heart had already turned back toward home, and she was weeping for the house she had left. And then her husband says, in effect, "All of that is beautifully told, my dear, and now let me tell them about the horse." And he describes her walking round it in the dark, imitating their wives, with a Trojan prince at her shoulder. Two accounts of the same nights, contradicting each other completely, told across a hearth in front of a guest by two people who are still married and who are going to go on living in that house together. Nobody in the poem comments on it. The subject changes. Somebody suggests bed. That is the most sophisticated thing in the entire tradition, and it was composed about 2,700 years ago, and every reader who notices it has to sit down for a minute. Which of them was lying is not answerable, and I would gently suggest that the poem is not asking. A great many people came out of that war with a version of themselves that they needed, and told it at dinner, and were not contradicted to their faces. Back to the horse, where it is now very late, and the last footsteps have gone, and the citadel is quiet. The signal comes from the sea. Out on the island where the fleet has been lying all day, they are waiting for one thing, a light. In most versions, it is raised by the man who was left in the reeds, from a high place, a torch or a fire on a headland, shown once the city has gone quiet, and the ships come back across in the dark without lamps, without singing, with the oars muffled in cloth where they sit in the leather loops. That crossing takes an hour or two. It is, in its way, the most peaceful passage in the story. A fleet moving over black water on a still night, and every man in it silent, and the low mass of the land ahead getting slowly larger. On the citadel, inside the wood, somebody unbolts the trapdoor. There is a sound they have all been waiting the entire day to hear, and it is a small one, the wooden bolt drawing back, and then the hinge. and then a rectangle of cold night air coming up into a space that has been 30 men's breath for 18 hours. The air is the thing. That is what every account of confinement comes back to. Not the light, the air, and how it tastes. The ladder goes down. They come down it one at a time, and they come down badly, because their legs have not held their weight since yesterday, and the first few have to hang on at the bottom until the feeling comes back. Some go for the gate, some go for the postern, and the rest wait in the dark under the belly of the horse, on the stones of a citadel, listening to a town asleep. I am not going to take you through what follows. It is the most famous night in Greek legend, and it is not what this channel is for, and there is nothing in it that anybody needs at bedtime. Let me give you only the outline, and let me give it to you the way the men on the citadel would have experienced it, which is again as sound, and then we will get out into the air. First, silence. Then a single voice somewhere below, questioning, not alarmed, a sentry who has seen movement and expects an explanation. Then the gate. That is the sound that ends it, and it is a sound that everybody in that city has heard 10,000 times without ever once being frightened of it. The great bar being lifted out of its brackets, and the leaves swinging on their pivots, and the low grinding groan of a heavy gate opening. Then the army coming in. Then the town waking up, not all at once, in patches, street by street, as it reaches them. And then a very long noise that goes on until dawn, which we will leave outside. By morning the city is gone. Not leveled, it is burning, and burning takes days, and much of the stone is still standing, and will stand for another 3,000 years. But everything that made it a city is over between midnight and sunrise, and the people who were dancing under the horse in the evening are dead, or walking down to the beach in a line, or hiding in a cellar. The old king is killed at an altar in his own courtyard, which is the detail the Greeks themselves never got over. That, and one more thing done at a temple by a man who should have known better, are the two acts that turn the victory sour. Because you can sack a city and go home, but you cannot take somebody off an altar and expect the sea to be kind to you afterwards. And the sea is not kind to them. Almost none of the men who came out of that horse gets home cleanly. One of them is blown around the Mediterranean for 10 years and loses every companion he has. One comes home to something worse than a storm. One is wrecked on rocks in sight of safety for something he said afterwards. The fleet that assembled with such enormous effort is scattered and broken and eaten piece by piece on the way back. And the people of Greece told those homecoming stories for centuries, and every single one of them is a story about paying for that night. That is the Greek verdict on their own greatest victory, and they delivered it themselves in their own poems without being asked. Come outside now. Come up onto the empty rampart with the sun coming up. The smoke is going straight up because there is no wind at this hour. Down on the plain, the ships are on the sand again in their old grooves, and men are carrying things down to them, and the whole thing looks less like a triumph than like a moving day. And on the citadel, in the middle of it, standing where they left it, with a spear hole in its flank and its head above the smoke, is a large wooden horse that nobody has any further use for. Nobody records what happened to it. It does not appear again in any account. It was probably burned with everything else, or broken up for firewood by an army that suddenly had a lot of cooking to do, or left standing until it fell apart. The most famous object in the history of warfare, and no one thought to write down what became of it. One last thing from inside, and then we can come out into the daylight and ask whether any of it happened. There is a question that the ancient tellers never quite answer, and modern readers ask immediately, what was the plan if it had gone wrong? There was none. That is the answer, and it is worth saying plainly, because it changes how the whole day reads. If the crowd had voted to burn it, they would have burned in it. If the axes had come out, 30 men would have been killed one at a time as they dropped through a trapdoor, by a city with every reason to take its time. If the spear thrown at the flank had gone in a hand's width lower, or if any one of them had coughed, or if the man who nearly answered had got a syllable out, that is the end, and there is no version in which they fight their way clear. They had no exit. They had committed to a plan whose entire success depended on other people making a specific mistake, and once the door was bolted from inside, there was nothing any of them could do to influence the outcome for 18 hours. That is a very unusual kind of operation to find in heroic poetry, where the point is normally that a man's strength decides things, and it explains the detail about the young one asking, over and over, when they were going to open the door. He was not impatient. He was doing what a person does when they have handed over control and cannot get it back, reaching for the one action still available. Some readers have found in that the reason the horse became the emblem of cleverness, rather than of courage. That what it actually dramatizes is the moment when the planning is finished and the plan has to be endured. The idea belongs to the man who thought of it. The night belongs to the 29 who sat in the dark with him and did nothing at all, extremely well. So, was there a horse? The honest answer is that a hollow wooden animal large enough to hold 30 armed men, hauled up a slope on rollers by an unsuspecting population, is not a thing that historians think happened. But the reasons it might have been remembered are more interesting than a flat no, and there are 4 of them, and each has serious people behind it. The first is the siege engine. We have the pictures. Assyrian palace reliefs, carved a couple of centuries after the period this story remembers, show wheeled assault machines being pushed against city walls. A covered frame with a hide roof to stop what is thrown from above, a beam swinging inside it to batter the gate, men crouched within, and a projecting head at the front. They were called things. Armies name their machines, and always have. A covered ram with a projecting head, worked by men hidden inside a wooden body on wheels, brought against a wall. You can see how a story about that survives 400 years of oral transmission and comes out the other end as a horse full of soldiers. A Greek travel writer of the 2nd century put it more bluntly than any modern scholar would dare. He said that anyone who does not think the Trojans were completely stupid must realize that the thing was a machine for breaking walls. The second theory is the earthquake, and it is my favorite because it makes the metaphor do the work. The god of the sea in Greek thought is also the god who shakes the earth, and he is also, and this is not a coincidence anybody ever explained, the god of horses. The bull and the horse are his animals. Earthquakes were his. When the ground moved, that was him. And the walls of that city on that mound show earthquake damage. One of the great layers there, a wealthy and heavily fortified city, ends in what looks very much like a seismic event, with walls displaced and structures collapsed and a rebuild afterwards. So, a fortified city that could not be taken by assault falls when the earth moves and the walls come down. And the god who did it is the horse god. A horse breached the walls of Troy. 300 years later, somebody asks what that means, and the answer has to be a big wooden one. The third is the ship. Ships in early Greek poetry are called the horses of the sea. They are built exactly as the horse is built. A hollow hull of ribs and planking, holding men, hauled up a beach on rollers. The Greeks who came in the night came in ships. A poet who describes them as horses is not doing anything unusual, and a later audience that has forgotten the idiom is left with a horse. And the fourth is that it is simply a story, a very old one, of a type that turns up all over the world, the enemy who gets inside by being carried in. There are versions with baskets, with sacks, with jars, with a coffin, with a gift load of goods. It is one of the oldest plots there is because it dramatizes the thing every walled community actually fears, which is not the army outside. What we can say for certain is that the horse is old, older than the poems we have. There is a storage jar found on the island of Mykonos, made around 670 before our era, which is roughly when or before the great poems were being fixed. On its neck there is a horse in relief, on wheels, and in the flank of the horse there are little square windows, and out of each window a human face is looking. That is the earliest picture of this we have, and it is already fully formed. Whoever made that jar expected anybody who saw it to know the story. Archaeology has given us the site, and the site is more interesting than any of the theories. 9 or 10 cities stacked on one mound above the plain, occupied for 3,500 years. Walls that slope outward at the base exactly as the poems describe. A gate with a tower, and 2 candidate layers for the war. One that fell to something violent around the right period, with unburied bodies in the streets and sling stones lying where they landed, and storage jars sunk into the floors of houses that had been divided up small. Which is what a town does when it is crowded with refugees and expecting a siege. One long-standing suggestion is that the poems remember not one war, but the general fact of that place, that it sat exactly where a trade route from the Northern Sea comes through a narrow strait, where the current runs against you and the wind blows the wrong way half the year, so that ships had to wait, and a city that controls the waiting gets rich, and a rich city on a strait is fought over more than once. None of that is the answer to what Odysseus heard, but it is the ground the story grew in, and it is worth knowing that there is a real hill with real walls that you can stand on, and the man who actually built it got a strange afterlife, which I like more than anything else in the reception of this story. He does not appear in the great poems as a character worth following. He is a boxer who wins a mule in the funeral games and a carpenter who makes a thing. He is not a king. He has no city, and he says himself that he is afraid of fighting. And yet, the Greeks who settled southern Italy in the centuries afterwards claimed him. More than one town down there said he had come to them after the war and founded the place. And in one of those cities, there was a temple where, according to ancient writers, they kept and displayed the iron tools with which he built the horse. Not the horse, the tools. A set of carpenter's implements in a temple, shown to visitors 1,000 miles and several centuries from the beach where they were supposedly used, and evidently worth the walk, or nobody would have written it down. There is something very appealing about a culture that keeps the ads. The heroes get poems. The frightened man who could do joinery gets his chisels in a display case, and a couple of towns arguing over which of them he founded. You can visit the hill, in fact. People do every summer. There is a large wooden horse in the car park. It was built in the 1970s. Children climb into it and wave out of the windows. Let us end where we began with the city, because it is still there and it has changed shape. It is night now, 3,000 years later. Go and stand on the mound. It is lower than you expect. That is what everybody says who visits. You have carried a picture of towers and a citadel on a crag, and what is actually there is a broad flat hill about the height of a few houses, with the excavated walls cut into it in terraces and trenches, and the layers labeled in numbers. The plain in front has silted up. The bay where 1,000 ships were drawn up is dry land now, farmland, and the sea has retreated several miles from where it was, so that the beach in the story is somewhere under a field of maize. There is wind here almost always. That is the one thing that has not changed at all. The north wind funneling down through the strait, the same wind that pinned fleets on that shore for weeks at a time and made a small town on a hill rich enough to be worth destroying. It comes over the top of the mound at night, with a dry sound in the grass. Below, the strait is a line of lights, ships going through, all night, every night, in both directions, the same passage, still one of the busiest stretches of water in the world. And in the dark on that hill there is nothing at all to hear, except the wind and the grass and, very faintly, the engines out on the water. Think about the men in the box one last time, and then we will let them go. They were not doing anything heroic. There is no fighting in the part of the story we have spent tonight in. There is no skill involved, and no courage of the kind that gets sung about. 30 men, sitting on planks in the dark, aching, cramped, terrified, keeping still. And the hardest hour of it was not the spear in the flank, and it was not the 4 crashes at the gate. It was the evening, the wine going round below them, the music in 3 keys, somebody's dog, a voice going over the same short tune, over and over, getting a child to sleep. Coming up through the wood into a wooden box full of armed men who had been away from home for 10 years. That is the thing they had to sit through without moving. Not danger, the ordinary sound of other people's lives, and the knowledge of what they were about to do to it. And then a woman walked around the outside in the dark and used their wives' voices, and one man could not bear it, and another put his hands over his mouth and held on. Whatever else that is, it is the most human minute in a story full of gods. Let it go now. All of it. The sap in the joints, the bronze on the boards, the rollers, the hymns, the 4 crashes at the threshold. Feel the wind coming over the mound and going on inland. There is dew on the grass, and it has soaked the hem of everything. There are stars over the strait, thick and low, and the lights of the ships crossing under them, patient in a queue, waiting for their turn at the narrow water exactly as they have always done. Nothing is hidden here now. Nothing is waiting inside anything. The city is a hill with grass on it, and the grass moves, and that is all it does. Let your breathing go, long and slow. Let your hands open. Let whatever you were holding on to today sit on the ground beside you until morning. You do not have to keep still for anyone. Sleep well.